Hi, welcome to another Power SQL training video. In this particular module, we will be looking at SQL queries. The first query we will be looking at is how to create a database query. In SQL, the create database statement is used to create a new SQL database. Now, let's take a look at the syntax. The SQL create database statement is used to create a new SQL database, and its basic syntax is as follows: create database, then the database name. Let's take a look at an example. In this example, we will create the database Power SQL. To achieve this, let's go to our PHP-MyAdmin interface. Now, once you get into the PHP-MyAdmin area, we'll click on the SQL tab. Now, let's put in our create database statement. Create database Power SQL. Once we have this, let's click on Go. Now, let's look at the left menu on our PHP-MyAdmin. We can now see the Power SQL, which is the data table that was created by the code we just ran. Let's click on it. We have the database, but we have no table inside. With this, we have successfully created a database by writing SQL queries. Also, we can use our SQL query to view the results of the databases that we have in our PHP-MyAdmin. So now, instead of checking from the left menu each time we create a database, we can simply run the following command: show databases, and then click on Go. This will show the list of databases that we have on our machine. Now, let's take a look at this. This is the Power SQL we created earlier. Now, let's look at the drop database statement. The SQL drop database statement is used to drop an existing database in the SQL schema. Let's take a look at the syntax. To write a drop database statement, we will need to use the drop function followed by the database. So we will have drop database, then the database name. Let's take a look at an example. And in this example, we will drop the database we created earlier, which is the Power SQL. Now, let's head over to our PHP-MyAdmin GUI. Now, let's try and drop the database we created earlier. Drop database Power SQL. I'll click on Go. And now, if we check our left menu, we won't see the Power SQL again. To confirm this also, we can write the show databases query also, and then click on Go. we can see from the listed results that we don't have our N power SQL again. In conclusion, let's assume the database we deleted has a lot of records. That's why we need to be careful when deleting a database, as this can result in the loss of complete information stored in that database. Now, let's take a look at how we can select a database using the use statement. Note that when you have multiple databases in your SQL schema, then before you can start your operation, you will need to select a database where all the operation will be performed. Now, to select the database, you will need to use the use statement. The use statement is used to select any existing database in the SQL schema. Let's take a look at the syntax of the use statement. The syntax is as follows. Use the use function and then the database name. Let's take a look at an example. Now, remember that we earlier deleted the N power SQL database. Now, let's create the database back. Now that we have the database created, I'll need to use the database. Now, by doing this, any other operation I perform inside my query box would be inside the database I selected, which is the N power SQL. Now, let's take a look at how to perform operations in the database. The first operation we'll be considering is how to create table in our SQL database. Now, before we create a table, we need to note that to create a table involves naming that table, defining the columns involved in that table, and also defining the data types of each column in the table. Let's take a look at the syntax for creating a table. Now, here is the basic syntax of the create table statement. To create a table, we will call the create table function, then the table name, then inside the brackets we will specify the columns we actually want to create. And also note the primary key, which will be the index field for the database table. Now, let's try out an example. In this example, we will create a database table called students. And then fill in the columns which our table will be having. We'll have the ID. The data type of the column should be integer, and then I don't want null value to be entered, so not null. Then we'll create the second column name. The name will be of variable character varchar, and the length should be 20 also not null. The not null would denote that we don't want null values to be entered into the column. Then we have the age. The age is integer, is also not null. After the age, we have the email. The email is variable character, varchar, and the length of the email is 20. The email is nullable. And then lastly, we will specify the primary key. The primary key for this table is the ID. So the ID column will be our primary key. And that's all. Let's click on the Go button. Now, we have successfully created a database table. To view our database table, let's click on the npower SQL database. And then, once we click on that, we can see the student table which we just created. Let's click on the students table. Now we can see the columns we specified while creating the table. We have the ID, we have the name, we have the age, and we have the email. This is the basic syntax of how to create a database table in SQL. Now, let's try out another SQL query. This time, we'll be looking at the drop table statement. The drop table statement is used to remove a table definition and all its data, indices, triggers, constraints, and permission from the table. Now, let's take a look at an example of how to delete a table from our database. I'll go back and use the database, which is npower SQL. Then the basic syntax for dropping a table is drop table, then the table name. The table name we want to drop here is student. By doing this, it will delete the table students from our database npower SQL. Let me click on Go. Now, if we come to npower SQL, we don't have a table inside of it again. This is so because by using the drop table statement, we have successfully deleted the database table. Now, we'll take a look at the insert query. But before then, let's create our student table back. Now, when you talk of the insert query, the SQL insert into statement is used to add a new rows of data to a table in the database. If you remember earlier in our PHP module, I showed you the syntax of how to write the insert query in MySQL. The syntax in MySQL is the same thing as the syntax we'll be using in SQL. Now, let's try out an example of the insert query. Now, let's insert into the students table the column ID, the name, and then we have the age, and then we have the email. Now we need to specify the values we want to insert into the table. So we have values for the ID column 1, and for the name is a string. You will remember we use variable character. The name should be my name, and then the age is an integer. So, and then we have the email. Now, we have actually written the insert into query. The syntax for the insert query is as follows: the insert into function, then the table name, then you open the braces and specify the column names you want to insert into, then the value keywords, then you specify the values in a sequence that matches the column you specified earlier. Now let's click on the Go button. Now let's go to the right menu, click on Empower SQL. Now let's click on the table students. Here we can see the values we inserted into the DB. We have successfully inserted a record into our DB. Next, we will be looking at the select query. The SQL select statement is used to fetch the data from a database table, which returns this data in a form of a result table. These result tables are called the result set. The syntax for a select statement in SQL is as follows: select column from table name, and that's all. If you want to select more than one column, you can specify the list of columns by using commas. Column 2, column 3, and so on. Now let's take a look at an example. In this example, we will select everything we have currently in our database, which is just one entry. Select all from students table. Now let's click on the Go button, and you can see the result here that we have one data entry selected. Now Let's try and select just the ID column and the name column from the result set. To achieve this, we'll do select ID, name from students, and when I click on the go button, we'll see our results. We can now see that only the column ID and the column name was returned from the table result set. This is how the select statement works in SQL. The next query we'll be looking at is the SQL update query. The SQL update query is used to modify an existing record in a database table. Let's take a look at an example of an update query. We have update the table name students, set name equals the basic syntax of writing an update query in SQL is to call the update SQL function, followed by the table name, and then the set function. Now we'll call the name of the column we actually want to set, and then the value we want to change it to. Now let's click on the go button. Now let's go into our database and then click on the students table to view our result. Now you can see that the name column has been changed to Bolade Hadroit, which is what we've just updated to. Lastly, the next SQL query we'll be considering is the SQL delete query. The SQL delete query is used to delete the existing records from a database table. Now, let's take a look at an example. Firstly, we'll use our database Empower SQL. Then our delete query, delete from the table name students, where ID equals 1. Here, the delete statement is used to remove a data entry from the database table. Here, you will discover that we are using a where clause, which will be explained better in the later videos. Now, let's click on the left menu on our database and then click on our students table. We will discover that the entry has been deleted. In conclusion, we've learned how the SQL database queries works. We've talked about the create query, the update query, the delete query, as well as the select query. we've also talked about how to use a database. Now, in the next video, we'll look at SQL clauses.